In the shadows of the collapsing Soviet Union, while politicians scrambled for power and ordinary people queued for bread, another force was rising, silent, ruthless, and unstoppable. They were not soldiers, yet they waged wars. They were not politicians, yet they controlled ministers. They were not businessmen, yet they owned banks, oil, and airports. This was the Russian Mafia, an empire of brutality born in prison camps, hardened in war zones, and unleashed on the world when the Iron Curtain fell. Their story is not just about crime. It is about how chaos creates monsters, how money rewrites morality, and how fear becomes a currency more powerful than gold. To understand the Russian Mafia, we must first step back into Soviet times. On the surface, the USSR presented itself as a state without crime. The government claimed to have eradicated capitalism's corruption, but beneath the propaganda was a different reality. Black markets thrived, corruption simmered, and prisons became breeding grounds for an entire criminal culture. Inside those prisons emerged the vori v zakone, thieves in law. These were not ordinary criminals. They were elite, crowned by other convicts in ceremonies, bound by a strict code of loyalty, secrecy, and defiance against the state. They refused to work regular jobs, lived only by theft and crime, and considered betrayal punishable by death. Tattoos across their bodies told their life stories. Stars on the shoulders meant authority. Churches inked on the chest showed prison terms served, and eyes on the chest symbolized watchfulness against betrayal. The Vori were more than a gang. They were a parallel society, an invisible mafia within the Soviet Union. And when the empire began to crack, they were ready to step into the light. The 1990s in Russia were chaos. The Soviet Union had dissolved, the economy collapsed, and millions lost jobs and savings overnight. State-owned industries, oil, gas, steel, banks, were being privatized in a wild, lawless scramble. For ordinary people, it meant hunger and despair. For the mafia, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. Factories could be bought for pennies, banks could be seized, entire shipping routes could be hijacked. Those who had guns, muscle, and connections became the new kings. Gangsters moved into every business imaginable: oil smuggling, weapons trafficking, drugs, prostitution, car theft, and protection rackets. If you opened a restaurant, a shop, or even a newspaper kiosk, you paid the mafia for protection, refuse, and your business might be burned to the ground, or worse, your family kidnapped. Russia in the 1990s became a battlefield between competing gangs, corrupt politicians, and desperate oligarchs. It was not uncommon to see bodies on Moscow streets, car bombs exploding in broad daylight, or masked gunmen settling scores in public. One of the darkest chapters was the so-called Great Mob Wars of the early 1990s. Rival gangs fought over Moscow, St. Petersburg, and beyond. The Chechen Mafia, hardened by brutal wars against Russia, became infamous for their ferocity. They kidnapped businessmen and even their families, demanding ransoms in millions. They brought battlefield discipline to the streets, and their violence terrified even the most hardened Russian criminals. Meanwhile, the Solntsevskaya Bratva, one of the largest mafia groups in Moscow, rose to dominance. Unlike the Chechens, they preferred brains over raw brutality. They infiltrated banks, invested in casinos and airports, and laundered billions through offshore accounts. While their rivals spilled blood on the streets, Solntsevskaya built a criminal empire disguised as a business empire. Gang wars turned Moscow into a city of fear. Contract killings became daily news. Judges, police officers, journalists, no one was safe. No story of the Russian Mafia is complete without its infamous bosses. Semyon Mogilevich, known as the Brainy Don, became perhaps the most feared of them all. Unlike others, he avoided flashy violence. Instead, he specialized in financial crime. His empire stretched across Russia, Europe, and the United States, involving arms trafficking, money laundering, and fraud schemes worth billions. The FBI once called him the most dangerous mobster in the world, and yet for decades, he managed to evade serious prosecution. Vyacheslav Ivankov, nicknamed Yaponchik, or Little Japanese, embodied the ruthless street gangster. Rising from Moscow's underworld, he expanded operations into the United States, running extortion and drug rings in New York. Arrested in America in the 1990s, he later returned to Russia, where he was assassinated in 2009. A reminder that in the mafia world, retirement is rare. The Solntsevskaya Bratva leaders, like Sergei Mikhailov, built their organization into one of the wealthiest and most structured mafias in the world. With tens of thousands of members and associates, they created a network that spanned continents, making billions through legal and illegal enterprises. These men were not just criminals. They were power brokers who could influence governments, silence enemies, and shift the flow of international money. The Russian Mafia's strength came from three weapons: fear, money, and murder. Violence was always on the table. Contract killings were executed with military precision. Victims were shot in elevators, poisoned in restaurants, or blown up in cars. These killings were not random. They were messages, warnings to anyone who dared to resist. Money laundering was equally vital. Stolen wealth was moved through banks in Cyprus, shell companies in the Caribbean, casinos in Eastern Europe, and even art galleries in London. Dirty money became invisible, impossible to trace. Corruption was the final key. Police, judges, politicians, all had their price. In the lawless Russia of the 1990s, the mafia's reach extended into the highest levels of power. In some cases, it became difficult to tell where the state ended and the mafia began. By the late 1990s and 2000s, Russian organized crime was no longer just a Russian problem. Its tentacles stretched across the globe. In the United States, Russian mobsters ran gambling, drug trafficking, and Medicare fraud schemes worth billions. In Israel, Russian immigrants carried with them criminal networks that shook the country's underworld. In Europe, they laundered money through banks, nightclubs, and property deals. Interpol and the FBI warned that Russian organized crime was among the most dangerous threats to global security. Unlike traditional mafias, it had no single structure. It was fluid, decentralized, and multinational, making it harder to fight and even harder to eliminate. Over time, the relationship between the Russian state and organized crime became complex. In the 1990s, criminals thrived because the state was weak. But as Vladimir Putin consolidated power in the 2000s, the chaos began to settle. Yet instead of destroying organized crime, some analysts argued that the state learned to use it. Criminal networks provided unofficial services, money moving, cybercrime expertise, even political influence abroad. Some groups operated with the quiet approval of authorities, as long as they did not challenge the Kremlin directly. This merging of state and crime created a new type of mafia, one that was not just a criminal problem, but a geopolitical weapon. Today, the Russian Mafia is not only about gangsters with guns. The battlefield has shifted into cyberspace. Groups connected to Russian criminal networks have been accused of running massive cybercrime operations, ransomware attacks, online fraud, and hacking campaigns that target governments and corporations worldwide. Billions are stolen not through bank heists with masks and pistols, but through computers in anonymous apartments. This evolution shows how adaptable and resilient the mafia has been. Where once they ruled streets with car bombs, now they rule digital highways with malware. But behind all the wealth and power lies a trail of suffering. Thousands of businessmen were killed in the 1990s mob wars. Families were torn apart by kidnappings. Journalists who exposed mafia ties were assassinated. Ordinary citizens lived in constant fear, paying protection money just to survive. The Russian Mafia is not a Hollywood fantasy. It is a brutal, bloody reality that has destroyed countless lives while enriching a few at the very top. The story of the Russian Mafia is far from over. It began in Soviet prison camps, grew in the chaos of the 1990s, and now thrives in the age of globalization and cybercrime. Its brutality, cunning, and adaptability have made it one of the most powerful criminal networks in modern history. And while governments claim to fight it, the mafia continues to evolve, invisible, untouchable, and deeply woven into the fabric of both Russia and the world. So what do you think is more dangerous? The mafia's bloody wars of the 1990s, or today's invisible cybercrime networks, where you may not even know you're the victim until it's too late? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe because in the next video, we'll uncover another dark empire hiding in plain sight.